Hey guys, tonight we're not here for a fairy tale, but for something raw and unsettling that happens inside my own home. You probably won't survive this story without feeling that sting of recognition, because I'm going to walk you through how my own son turned our house into something that felt more like a training camp than a family sanctuary. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to watch the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. I don't want a crowd of strangers. I want people who actually care about peeling back the layers of messy family life. Invite yourself into this room, whatever city you're in. Maybe you're in a tiny apartment or a quiet country house. It doesn't matter. The drama I'm about to share could reach into anyone's living room. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's comfortably embark on tonight's journey. It begins with my son deciding that family order needed to look more like a corporate memo. He started pinning handwritten notes on the fridge with rules. No loud conversations after 9, no leaving dishes in the sink, no TV without his approval. At first, it felt like a quirky phase, but soon it spread like ivy across the walls of our daily life. He treated us not like relatives, but like employees who needed quarterly reviews. I laughed the first time I saw one of his little notices, but that laugh quickly soured when I realized he was dead serious. It's strange how laughter, that soft reflex, can turn into silence when you realize the joke isn't a joke at all. The first rule he enforced was at dinner. Plates had to be aligned. No one could start until he gave a nod. If you think this sounds military, you'd be right. People still debate whether strict rules bring harmony or suffocate love. He was convinced he was protecting us from chaos. Well, what chaos? A little spilled soup? I kept quiet, though inside I felt the walls tightening. There's a psychological fact I once read, that children raised in rigid households either rebel completely or repeat the pattern as adults. I never imagined I would watch my own son choose repetition. One evening, as we were setting the table, he corrected me for placing the forks on the wrong side. "Efficiency, Mom," he muttered, like he was lecturing a junior employee. I thought of the odd rituals I'd seen in other families, how in some cultures the eldest must break bread before anyone else can touch food. My son, without realizing it, was inventing his own ritual, one that crowned him king at the table. He didn't even know that in our city's inheritance laws, the oldest doesn't always get the largest share. The law bends differently than tradition. That irony made me smile inside, even as he scolded me for touching the serving spoon too early. The strangest part? Others began to comply. My daughter-in-law avoided eye contact and quietly rearranged things to please him. My granddaughter whispered jokes about Daddy's dictatorship, but only when he was out of earshot. I sat back, observing, letting him believe his empire was unchallenged. And maybe, in a guilty way, I enjoyed letting him think he had all the power. You know that odd sense of theater when you watch someone perform, not knowing the script you're holding behind your back is thicker than theirs? That was me. But the mood in the house shifted. The laughter at dinner faded. Conversations shortened. My granddaughter once asked me quietly, "Grandma, is he always going to be like this?" Children sense tension faster than adults give them credit for. Family psychologists say kids pick up emotional cues even before they learn to read. It's like their radar is sharper. And yet adults convince themselves they're hiding the cracks. My son, in his little regime, didn't realize how visible those cracks had become. Here's a funny side note. I once joked to myself that he was trying to run a small dictatorship without realizing that the dictator's chair was already occupied by me, tucked away in another building. That's right, the company he never knew I owned. Picture him rehearsing power speeches in the living room while I quietly signed paychecks in a downtown office. It's like letting a child wear a paper crown while you know the real crown is locked away in your closet. The irony was delicious, though I couldn't tell anyone yet. I started keeping notes, not rules like him, but quiet reflections in a journal. Observing his system made me think about how families, across time, always invent strange hierarchies. Some households revolve around the eldest son, some around the mother who controls the kitchen, others around invisible debts no one speaks about. My son wanted a visible, loud hierarchy, and that made it easier for me to play the waiting game. People still debate whether letting someone spiral in their own illusion is kinder than confronting them head-on. I lean toward letting him spiral. After all, every regime falls eventually. Sometimes, though, the silence pressed too heavy. I'd catch myself staring at the fridge where his notes fluttered and imagine tearing them down. One night I almost did, but then I remembered the cruel laugh he gave me at dinner when I spilled a little sauce. He leaned back, arms crossed, like a boss docking an employee's pay. That laugh stuck like a thorn, and I realized, better to save my moment. Better to let his arrogance grow fat until the truth could slice it open. So here we are, the beginning of a long unraveling. He thought he was building power with pens and fridge magnets, but he didn't realize I had the real keys. The night air that summer felt heavy, sticky, like even the house walls were sweating under the pressure. And yet I slept peacefully, knowing secrets always outlive temporary regimes. Dinner that night was worse than usual, the atmosphere like a business meeting where no one dares to cough. My son took his seat at the head of the table, which used to be my husband's place before he passed. He tapped his glass twice, as if calling order to a courtroom, and everyone froze. "Before we begin," he said, "let's review the week." Imagine that, review the week. Not ask how we're doing, not bless the meal, but review performance, like we were employees at his little firm. My daughter-in-law nodded politely, though I could see the tired twitch in her smile. My granddaughter rolled her eyes beneath her lashes, pretending to smooth her napkin. And me? I sat perfectly still, calculating the moment when the curtain would finally fall on his show. That evening he turned to me, his own mother, and in front of everyone he said, "Mom, maybe you should sit at the smaller table. It's easier for you." Easier? That word cut sharper than any knife. He wanted me sidelined, like old furniture stored in the garage. Family experts say mealtime is supposed to strengthen bonds. Shared food, shared laughter, eye contact across plates. Instead, my son used it as a stage to assert dominance, eroding the very thing that makes a family feel like family. People still debate whether humiliation is ever justified as discipline. But let me tell you, when it comes from your own blood, it feels like betrayal carved into your bones. I forced a smile. Humor can be a shield, so I joked, "What's next? Should I wear a uniform?" Everyone laughed nervously, except him. He didn't laugh. He smirked. That smirk told me he enjoyed the imbalance. It's a strange human quirk. Some people feed off others' discomfort the way bees feed on nectar. He wasn't cruel enough to notice he was crossing lines, but arrogant enough to think no one would challenge him. Later that week, I overheard him telling my daughter-in-law that he was the pillar of this household now, and everyone needed to follow his structure. The word pillar echoed in my mind. In ancient rituals, the pillar is the symbol of strength, but also of burden. Did he realize that pillars eventually crack when they carry too much? I wanted to whisper to him, "Boy, you think you're holding this house up, but I've been carrying the foundation for years with my quiet hands." At another dinner, he mocked me for forgetting to pass the salt. It sounds trivial, right? Just salt. But he exaggerated the mistake, wagging his head as if I were a careless child. "Mom, you're slowing us down," he said. Slowing them down? Dinner isn't a race. In some cultures, meals can stretch for hours, with stories, wine, and pauses for silence. He wanted it trimmed into efficiency, cut to the bone like a spreadsheet. That's when I realized he wasn't running a family. He was rehearsing control. I leaned on small acts of rebellion. I deliberately placed the spoon on the wrong side, just to feel the spark of disobedience. My granddaughter noticed and winked at me, a tiny secret alliance forming under the table. She once whispered, "Grandma, you're the only one who doesn't look afraid." That's the thing about regimes. They're built on fear. But fear only works until someone remembers they have another option. There's a fact I carry from reading about group dynamics. When one person breaks a pattern, even in a small way, it can unravel the whole system. One person laughing at the tyrant can start the avalanche. That gave me hope. Still, I stayed patient. Strange patience, like sitting through a play when you already know the ending. People still debate whether it's braver to confront early or to wait until the perfect strike. I chose waiting, because timing is everything, especially when the truth in my safe deposit box was strong enough to crush his illusions in one blow. Sometimes I caught myself daydreaming about standing up mid-dinner, slamming the company documents on the table, and watching their jaws drop. But then I'd remember my late husband's words, "Never waste a good secret too early. Let it simmer until it feeds you." Secrets are like soup. They taste richer when you let them boil long enough. The humiliation stung, though. I'd go to my room after meals and feel the sting of being dismissed, my authority questioned in the very house I built. Yet, oddly enough, that sting reminded me of my own resilience. You can laugh at me at dinner, I thought, but remember, I signed papers that could turn your whole world upside down. He didn't know that the building downtown, the one with glass windows reflecting the sun like a mirror, had my name on the title. He didn't know that the staff greeting, "Good morning, ma'am," weren't speaking to some stranger, but to his own mother. And maybe that's why I endured the mockery. Let him laugh, let him puff his chest, because I held the real laughter inside me, the kind that comes when truth finally surfaces. If you've ever been underestimated, you know the pleasure of waiting for the reveal. It's like being called a pawn when you're secretly the queen. That night, after clearing the plates in silence, I stood in the kitchen and stared at the reflection of the chandelier in the window. My face looked tired, but not defeated. The humiliation at dinner had only sharpened my resolve. The regime was tightening, yes, but every regime has cracks, and mine were widening under his very feet. By the third week of his little reign, the house felt like a boarding school run by a strict headmaster. He added more rules: lights out by 10, phones collected in a basket before bed, no snacking between meals. I almost expected him to hand out demerit slips. My granddaughter whispered that she felt like she was in a monastery without prayers. I chuckled at her honesty, but the truth is, the weight of those rules pressed down on all of us. Psychologists often write about how control, disguised as discipline, is really about fear, not love. People still debate whether strong boundaries make kids secure or anxious. I could see the answer forming right in front of me. Anxious silence, spreading like fog in the corridors. One rule, though, stood out as truly bizarre. He decided that no one was allowed to rearrange the furniture without his approval. Chairs, cushions, even family photos had to stay exactly where he wanted them. It was his way of freezing the house in his design, like a museum of obedience. I thought about strange customs I'd read about, how in some villages the eldest son must protect the family hearth, even policing who sits near the fire. My son had turned into one of those gatekeepers, except instead of warmth, he guarded cold control. One night I tested his rule. I moved a small vase 2 inches to the left. That's all, 2 inches. The next morning, he stormed into the room, picked it up, and slammed it back into its place. His wife looked away, embarrassed, while my granddaughter shot me a look of silent solidarity. It was absurd, grown adults arguing over a vase, but behind the absurdity lay something darker. He wasn't defending a vase, he was defending his sense of power. At breakfast, he lectured us about efficiency again, as if the house was a machine and we were parts that needed oiling. I thought of something strange I'd once read. In some inheritance disputes, courts have to decide not only who gets the property, but who gets to keep the furniture exactly where it is, because moving a chair can symbolize breaking tradition. Isn't that wild? A chair can carry the weight of history. That made me smile inside, because I knew my son was playing with symbols he didn't even understand. He thought he was building authority. I saw a boy hiding behind rules. He grew bolder, correcting me in front of guests. A neighbor came by and he interrupted my story mid-sentence to say, "Mom exaggerates, don't take her too seriously." My cheeks burned, but I swallowed the anger. I reminded myself, patience is a weapon. You don't swing it fast. You sharpen it quietly. Humor, again, became my shield. I quipped, "Well, if I'm exaggerating, maybe I'll start charging for my stories." The neighbor laughed. My son didn't. He hated when humor dissolved his authority. But the real turning point came when he created what he called the schedule. It was a typed list, taped to the fridge, with slots for when each person could use the living room, the washing machine, even the car. A regime on paper. My granddaughter whispered, "Grandma, are we prisoners?" I patted her hand and whispered back, "Prisoners who know where the key is." There's a fact worth noting. In families where one person dominates, others adapt by shrinking. They lower their voices, shorten their steps, hide their true selves. I saw that happening here. My daughter-in-law's laugh faded. My granddaughter's drawings grew darker. My own silence stretched longer. And yet, beneath that silence, I felt the steady beat of rebellion. People still debate whether it's better to adapt for peace or resist for dignity. I knew my answer already. Dignity must never be bargained away. The strangest ritual he imposed was around the television. He decided only educational programs could be watched, and only if he approved. Imagine, grown adults asking permission to watch the news. I remembered a story about how, in some cultures, the father controls the radio, dictating what songs the family hears. Those small acts of control shape entire generations. But what my son didn't understand was that you can't control what people think once the show ends. Minds wander, thoughts rebel. One evening, he found me watching a documentary on inheritance laws. He scoffed, saying, "Why waste time on this?" You don't need to know, I almost laughed out loud. If only he knew how well I knew. If only he knew that while he tightened rules around vases and televisions, I held in my hands documents that could rewrite his entire story. The cruelty sharpened when he started mocking my forgetfulness. If I misplaced my glasses, he'd say, "See, this is why I need to run things. You'd lose the house otherwise." Lose the house? I bit my tongue. I could have said, "Son, I own far more than this house." Instead, I stayed silent, letting the words burn quietly until the right moment. Later that night, I stood in my room, looking at the locked drawer where I kept the company's papers. The embossed seal shimmered in the lamplight. He thought he was the ruler here, but these papers whispered otherwise. Holding them, I felt like a magician with a hidden card. It was almost funny. Almost. And so I endured his strange control rituals, not because I was powerless, but because power tastes sweeter when revealed at the right time. The vase, the schedule, the smirk, they were all notes in a symphony he thought he was conducting, but I was the one who owned the orchestra. Whispers about inheritance began to circulate like drafts sneaking through old windows. Relatives who rarely visited started calling, dropping hints in their polite voices about the future of the family home. My son, puffed up by his self-appointed authority, fed those whispers. He strutted through gatherings as if the estate already bore his name. He didn't know that the real weight of my assets wasn't hidden under the roof we sat beneath, but in the downtown company he had never set foot in. Funny how people debate whether it's wiser to reveal wealth early to avoid suspicion, or to hide it so that masks fall away naturally. I chose the latter, letting everyone reveal their true selves while they thought I was powerless. One Sunday lunch, a cousin leaned toward me and said, "Of course the eldest son should manage everything one day." She said it with the smug confidence of someone repeating a cultural cliché. In many traditions, the eldest is expected to inherit the largest share, but laws don't always follow tradition. In fact, I once read that in some countries, assets are automatically divided equally, no matter what the will says. My cousin didn't know that. She thought she was flattering my son. He smirked at her words, as if destiny was already sealed in his favor. It stung, though, hearing the way they erased me while I was still alive. My son's rules, their whispers, the way eyes slid past me. It was like being a ghost at my own table. And yet, ghosts have a strange kind of power. They watch unseen, they hear what others ignore. And I heard plenty. The gossip thickened when my son started hinting at future expansions of the house. Expansions? He talked about knocking down walls, remodeling the kitchen, even renting out a room for income. He spoke as if the deeds already bore his signature. My granddaughter glanced at me with wide eyes, silently asking if it was true. I shook my head subtly, my lips pressed together. That small gesture told her everything. The kingdom he boasted about wasn't his to give. I found myself studying the dynamics of inheritance more closely, almost like research for a secret thesis. Did you know that in medieval Europe, daughters were sometimes given symbolic tokens, like a spoon or a chest, to acknowledge their claim, while sons got the land? Strange rituals, reminding me of how symbolic objects still matter. In our house, even that vase I shifted a few inches became a battlefield. Every family has its tokens, its silent emblems of power. My company's papers were mine. One evening, during a particularly tense dinner, my son raised his glass and toasted to the future leader of this family. He said it so casually, but his eyes were sharp, daring anyone to disagree. My daughter-in-law clapped nervously. My cousin smiled too wide, but my granddaughter frowned. I nearly laughed. The theater of it all was absurd, like watching a boy play king with cardboard swords while the real weapons hung behind locked doors. After dinner, I overheard two relatives discussing what will happen when she's gone. She. That's how they referred to me, as if I were already in past tense. I sat in the hallway listening, my hands gripping the armrest of the chair. They speculated about who would run the family fortune, assuming it was all wrapped up in the house and a few accounts. They didn't know that I signed documents every month that influenced dozens of lives: salaries, contracts, growth. They didn't know that my signature carried far more weight than any of their whispers. But here's the paradox. Part of me wanted to scream the truth, slam down the papers, and silence their arrogance. Another part of me savored their ignorance. It's like watching people argue over a treasure chest, unaware that the real gold is buried somewhere else entirely. People still debate whether ignorance is bliss. In this case, their ignorance was my armor. I began noticing who leaned closer to my son, flattering him, hoping to secure their piece of the imagined pie. Cousins, in-laws, even neighbors seemed to orbit around his performance. It reminded me of historical courts, where courtiers would flatter princes, even when the king was still alive. I was that king, sitting silently, letting them bow to the wrong figure. Sometimes silence is the sharpest crown. Still, the cruelty of erasure cut deep. My son stopped asking my opinion on household matters altogether. He even changed the locks on a cabinet where I kept old letters, saying it was for safekeeping. Safekeeping from me? The irony burned. But instead of confronting him, I let the act sear into memory. Remember that cruel laugh in the hotel lobby? This was its echo. His little smirk at dinner, his smug glance at cousins, his assumption that he already owned what wasn't his. That night, alone in my room, I pulled out the envelope again. The company seal shimmered under the lamplight, crisp and undeniable. My name, my ownership, my legacy. In that moment, I whispered to myself, let him have his regime. Let them whisper. When the time comes, the truth will not just surprise them. It will dismantle everything they thought they controlled. The study was the only place left untouched by his little kingdom. He avoided it like a sacred ground, or maybe he sensed there was something in there he couldn't control. I kept the door locked, and even when he teased me about hoarding old papers, he never tried to enter. Perhaps he thought the room was just dusty relics of my past. Letters, faded photographs, the echo of my late husband's books. He didn't know that behind the mahogany desk, in a drawer that squeaked faintly when opened, sat the documents with my signature stamped in gold. The company's name, the ownership seal, the proof of who I really was. It's interesting how every house has a room people avoid. Some say it's superstition, others say it's instinct. Anthropologists talk about forbidden chambers in family homes, spaces that become taboo simply because they carry too much memory. People still debate whether we avoid them out of respect or fear. In my son's case, fear worked for me. His rules covered the kitchen, the living room, even the garden, but never the study. That was my realm. On quiet afternoons, I would retreat there. I'd sit at the desk and run my fingers over the embossed seal on the papers, feeling the texture of truth under my hand. Outside, I could hear his voice booming about chores, about discipline, about how a house without order collapses. I smiled in the silence of my study, thinking of how many actual houses I had kept upright through contracts and ledgers. His little empire was measured in fridge notes and lectures. Mine was measured in balance sheets and employees who depended on me. The contrast was almost comical. One evening, curiosity got the better of my granddaughter. She knocked gently on the study door and whispered, "Grandma, why does Dad never come in here?" I let her step inside, her eyes widening at the shelves lined with books and the faint smell of old paper. I didn't show her the documents, but I let her sit in my husband's old chair. "Some rooms hold more truth than others," I told her softly. She nodded, sensing the weight without knowing the details. Children understand more than we give them credit for. Family dynamics experts often note that grandchildren form unique alliances with grandparents, seeing them not as authority figures, but as quiet anchors. I felt that bond with her deepening in that moment. But the study also became my refuge for reflection. I thought about strange rituals across cultures, like in some Asian families where the family altar room is kept spotless, no one entering except to light incense. My study was my altar, not of religion, but of memory and control. Every time I closed the door, I reclaimed a piece of dignity my son tried to strip away. Of course, his curiosity itched at the edges. Once, he asked, "Why do you lock that room? Are you hiding something?" He said it with a half-joke tone, but his eyes lingered. I replied calmly, "Every house needs a locked door." He laughed, but uneasily. He didn't press further, perhaps because some part of him knew power lives behind closed doors, and he wasn't ready to confront it. There's a psychological truth I once read, that the space we protect the most is often where our identity lives. For my son, his identity lived on the fridge with his rules. For me, it lived in the drawer of that study. People still debate whether identity should be displayed proudly or guarded quietly. My choice was quiet. Sometimes, sitting at that desk, I imagined the moment of revelation. The whole family gathered, my son puffed up like usual, and then me placing the papers on the table, watching silence fall like a curtain. Inheritance disputes often boil down to a single page of paper. I had an entire folder. The power wasn't just in the wealth. It was in the fact that I had waited, watched, endured. The study also gave me humor, oddly enough. Once, while dusting the shelves, I chuckled to myself. If he knew the empire was run from this creaky chair, he'd forbid me from sitting here at all. Humor keeps bitterness from curdling, and I clung to it. The room grew more precious as the rest of the house grew colder. Dinner became silent marches. Living room conversations turned shallow, and even birthdays felt staged. But in the study, I could breathe. It was as if the walls themselves whispered, "Patience. The time will come." And so I waited, sharpening silence into strength, keeping the secret alive in the room my son feared most. Clashes over cultural customs started surfacing like cracks in old plaster. My son began invoking tradition whenever it suited his rule book, cherry-picking rituals as if they were tools in his belt. He insisted, for example, that everyone greet him first when entering the room, a twisted echo of how in some families the eldest is greeted to show respect. I found it odd because when he was younger he never cared about such things. He rushed straight for dessert without a word, but now, cloaked in his new authority, he demanded recognition like a patriarch. People still debate whether reviving old customs strengthens family identity or simply weaponizes history for control. Watching him, I leaned toward the latter. One night he lectured us about ancestral respect, saying we had to preserve our lineage pride. He even forbade casual clothing at Sunday meals, insisting we wear something formal. I couldn't help but laugh quietly to myself. He wore jeans with holes back in college, and now he was dictating dress codes? My granddaughter giggled when I whispered, "Maybe next week he'll require tuxedos." She nearly spilled her soup trying not to laugh, and for a brief moment the regime cracked with humor. But underneath his theatrics, I recognized a familiar cultural tactic. I once read about Mediterranean families where inheritance rituals involved elaborate ceremonies, the eldest son parading through the town square to prove his worth. My son had no town square, so he turned our dining room into one. He didn't know that parades don't determine ownership. Documents do. The irony made me smile, though bitterness tugged at the edges. The cruelest blow came when he used my own traditions against me. I had always lit a candle at dinner in memory of my husband, a quiet ritual no one questioned. But one evening, my son blew out the candle before the meal began, declaring, "We need to focus on the present, not the past." His words hung heavy. The flame gone, my heart clenched. Family rituals are not just habits, they are anchors, keeping memory alive. To see him erase that anchor felt like losing my husband twice. Later, in the kitchen, I heard him telling my daughter-in-law that old customs weigh us down. Well, she nodded weakly, but her eyes darted toward me, almost apologetically. It reminded me of a fact I once came across. In some cultures, daughter-in-laws are trapped between loyalty to their husbands and silent respect for the mother-in-law. That tension often defines generations. People still debate whether women should resist or adapt, but the truth is, silence often becomes their survival strategy. I saw that survival etched in her smile. Meanwhile, my granddaughter quietly rebelled. She sketched little drawings of me wearing a crown hidden in her notebooks. Once, she slipped me a picture of me standing tall while everyone else bowed. I chuckled, pressing the drawing to my chest. In that moment, I realized she was my silent ally. Every regime breeds resistance, even if it starts with crayons and whispers. At another gathering, my son insisted we follow a strange new ritual he invented. Everyone had to express gratitude to him before eating. Imagine that, gratitude to him, not to the cook, not to the day, not even to life itself. My granddaughter refused. She kept her lips sealed, her eyes burning with quiet defiance. He scolded her, but I felt pride swelling in my chest. That night, I hugged her and whispered, "Courage runs in your blood." In my study later, I thought about how fragile power becomes when it relies on ritual instead of respect. A ritual imposed is just theater, and theater collapses when the audience stops clapping. My son was forcing applause, but the silence was creeping in. People still debate whether tradition holds families together or tears them apart when twisted. In my house, it was tearing. And yet, I stayed patient. Humor kept me afloat. When he declared we had to stand for his announcements, I muttered, "Should I also salute?" My granddaughter snorted, and even my daughter-in-law nearly choked on her tea. He glared, but the laughter had already slipped through his fingers. Custom, rituals, invented ceremonies, all of it was smoke and mirrors. Behind the smoke, my documents lay safe. Real, undeniable. He could twist traditions, but he couldn't twist signatures. My company, my name, my truth, they remained untouched. And as he played with fire, erasing my candle and demanding gratitude, I knew one day that very flame would return, brighter than ever, burning his illusions to ash. My granddaughter became my mirror, the only one brave enough to reflect what was really happening. She was too young to play politics, too honest to hide what she saw. Her eyes followed every tense moment. Her little sketches captured truths the adults ignored. One afternoon, she slid a folded page into my palm. It was a drawing of her father standing tall with a crown on his head. But next to him was me, holding the crown in my lap. "Grandma," she whispered, "I think you're the real queen." My throat tightened. Out of the mouths of children comes the wisdom adults fear to speak. Psychologists often say children become the quiet recorders of family dynamics, noticing subtleties even when words are forbidden. People still debate whether they should be shielded from tension or included in its resolution. Watching her bravery, I believed in inclusion. Her silent defense showed in little acts. When her father barked at me for misplacing a spoon, she'd place one deliberately wrong the next night. When he demanded gratitude speeches, she'd mumble, "Thank you, Grandma," instead, loud enough to sting. Once, when he declared respect must be earned by authority, she whispered to me later, "But respect should be given to kindness." That sentence lingered in my heart like a balm against his cruelty. The bond between grandparents and grandchildren is often underestimated. I once read about a study showing that grandchildren view their grandparents as protectors, even more than their parents at times, because the bond skips the direct line of authority. My granddaughter proved that truth daily. She'd sneak into my study with wide eyes, inhaling the dusty paper smell as though it were sacred air. She asked me once, "Grandma, what do you keep so safe in here?" I smiled, running my fingers along the locked drawer, and said, "Dreams that are waiting for their moment." She giggled, satisfied with mystery. Her father noticed her loyalty and didn't like it. One evening, he snapped at her for siding with me during an argument about the candle ritual. "You're too soft, like your grandmother," he hissed. She burst into tears, and I had to bite back my fury. People still debate whether parents have the right to shape their children's allegiances, but watching him try to bend her spirit, I felt the rage of a lioness. Her tears watered the soil of my determination. I consoled her later in the garden. We sat under the old oak tree, its branches swaying like a slow breath, and I told her stories about when her father was a boy. She laughed when I described how he once cried over a broken toy car, insisting he'd fix it with tape. "He wasn't always this bossy," I said. She leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, "Then maybe he can change back." Hope in her voice softened me. Hope is a strange force. It can make rebellion lighter, almost joyful. I decided then to give her a glimpse of truth. I didn't show her the company papers, but I told her, "You know how your dad thinks he makes all the rules? Sometimes the real power belongs to the quietest person in the room." She looked at me as though I had given her a treasure map. In that moment, we became allies not just in secret rebellion, but in shared knowledge. Silence can be sharper than shouting. Humor kept us afloat, too. Once, when her father demanded we line up our shoes in military order, she whispered, "Grandma, should I shine mine until I can see my face?" I chuckled so hard I nearly gave us away. That laughter felt like oxygen in the suffocating house. In family regimes, humor is resistance disguised as play. One evening, she asked me why people fight over inheritance. I told her the truth, that money isn't just money in families. It's memory, pride, and proof of worth. She frowned, saying, "But shouldn't love be the proof?" I hugged her tightly. Out of all the theories I'd read, none matched the purity of her answer. People still debate whether inheritance should be abolished to preserve love. If you ask my granddaughter, the answer would be yes. As days passed, her quiet defiance grew bolder. She'd stand taller when her father scolded me. She'd place flowers by my plate as if crowning me queen of the table. He grew irritated but couldn't crush her spirit. Watching her was like watching the first crack of dawn split the night. And I knew then, when the time came to reveal the truth, she would be my witness. Not because she needed the wealth, but because she needed proof that kindness outlives cruelty. That is the inheritance I wanted to pass down more than anything, though the documents in my study would help too. The breaking point didn't arrive with a shout, but with a laugh. Not just any laugh, the cruel laugh he let out at a family gathering, one that echoed like a hammer hitting glass. We were in a hotel lobby after a cousin's wedding, the whole family gathered, when I tripped slightly on the marble step. My son caught me with his arm, but instead of steadying me gently, he threw back his head and laughed. Loud, cruel. The kind of laugh that says, "You are weak and I am strong." Everyone froze, eyes darting to me, waiting to see how I'd react. My granddaughter clenched her fists, her small frame trembling. My daughter-in-law looked away, cheeks flushed with shame. And me? I steadied myself, my heart racing, but inside, something shifted. That laugh was the spark that lit the fuse. Psychologists note that humiliation in public is one of the most lasting forms of betrayal in families. It lingers longer than arguments in private because it turns dignity into theater. People still debate whether humiliation can ever teach resilience. To me, it only taught clarity. This regime of his had to end. I smiled faintly in that lobby, hiding the storm brewing in my chest. "Careful," I said, brushing off my dress, "the marble's slippery." My voice calm, my steps steady, but my resolve hardened into stone. That laugh would not go unanswered. From that day, I began to prepare, not just in thought, but in action. I started moving documents closer to hand, reviewing the papers in my study more often, rehearsing the scene where I would drop the truth on the table like a stone into still water. People talk about the moment they knew something had to change. For me, it was that laugh. Remember that cruel laugh in the hotel lobby? It was the sound of the regime cracking, even if he didn't hear it yet. At home, his rules grew tighter, perhaps sensing rebellion in the air. He limited how long we could use lights in the evening to save electricity. He rationed who could use the car and when, and he even set timers for how long we could talk at the table. A timer! My granddaughter smirked at me as the alarm buzzed, whispering, "Grandma, did we just run out of words?" We both giggled quietly, our laughter a counterattack to his authority. Humor can be rebellion, too. But the tension built. My daughter-in-law whispered apologies when he wasn't around, promising she didn't agree with his methods but felt trapped. I squeezed her hand in silence. I knew too well how survival sometimes requires complicity. In old family customs, women often bowed to the authority of men to keep the peace, even when their hearts rebelled. Some traditions, sadly, survive because silence preserves them. People still debate whether silence makes you complicit or simply keeps you safe. Watching her, I believed it was both. Meanwhile, my son strutted like a peacock, convinced his order was unshakable. At a cousin's birthday, he declared himself the organizer of this family's future. The words made me nearly choke on my cake. I bit my tongue to keep from laughing, because in my study lay the real organizer, the documents proving who truly held the reins. He believed the empire was his, while the deeds whispered otherwise. That laugh in the hotel replayed in my mind at night, each echo sharpening my determination. I knew timing mattered. If I revealed my ownership too early, they'd dismiss it as stubborn pride. But if I waited until his arrogance reached its peak, the fall would be unforgettable. There's a fact about inheritance I once read. In some disputes, the final reveal of documents doesn't just settle property, it reshapes relationships for generations. The moment of truth becomes legend, retold at gatherings for decades. I wanted my reveal to be that kind of legend. One evening, I stood in front of the mirror, holding the folder close. I imagined the scene. My son mocking me again, relatives nodding, whispers thick in the air, and then silence as the papers landed. I almost laughed at the thought. Humor again kept bitterness from choking me. "Let him laugh now," I murmured. "My turn will come." And so, after that breaking point, I stopped feeling like a victim of his rules. Every cruel laugh, every fridge note, every lecture became fuel. I endured his regime not because I was powerless, but because I was waiting for the perfect stage. The laugh that humiliated me would become the laugh that ended him. The night I finally considered pulling the documents from my study was quieter than most. Rain tapped against the windows, the house smelled faintly of soup, and yet tension pressed thicker than the storm outside. My son had just finished another lecture at dinner, this time about how real families need structure, and how without leadership we fall apart. Leadership. He said it like a badge, puffing his chest, while I sat silently with a secret empire folded in a drawer. That word stung, not because I doubted my own strength, but because he had no idea what true leadership looked like. Leadership isn't fridge notes and cruel smirks. It's the quiet weight of responsibility, of feeding people with paychecks, of decisions made in silence that ripple through lives. I knew that truth. He didn't. After dinner, when everyone retreated, I slipped into the study. I unlocked the drawer, pulled out the envelope, and spread the documents across the desk. Ownership papers, shareholder agreements, tax receipts, all stamped with my name. The ink felt alive under my fingertips. This was no fantasy. This was proof. People still debate whether wealth should be hidden from children until they are mature or revealed early to guide them. My late husband believed in patience, and I had honored that belief all these years. But now, with my son's regime tightening, patience tasted like poison. I imagined slamming these papers down at the table, silencing his booming voice, watching relatives' jaws drop. The thought made me chuckle, a low, quiet laugh that startled even me. Humor is strange. It can erupt even when you're plotting a storm. Imagine their faces, I whispered to myself. Imagine the silence. But I hesitated. Timing, as always, mattered. I thought about historical inheritance rituals, where the reveal of a will was delayed until the whole clan gathered. That delay wasn't just legal, it was theatrical, ensuring maximum impact. Was I ready for my theater? People still debate whether secrets empower or corrode. I could feel both forces pulling at me. My granddaughter slipped into the room that evening, her small face framed by the lamplight. She saw the papers spread on the desk and asked softly, "Grandma, is that your secret?" My heart pounded. I smiled and said, "Yes, but it's not ready yet." She nodded as if she already understood timing better than most adults. She leaned against me, her warmth grounding me, and whispered, "When you do tell them, can I sit next to you?" My throat tightened. "Of course," I replied. In that moment, I knew she was not just an ally, she would be my witness. Later, alone, I thought about how fragile illusions are. My son believed his little speeches created order, but the truth was, one signature could dismantle everything he built. It reminded me of an odd fact. In some inheritance cases, a single overlooked clause can shift millions from one relative to another, leaving families in shock. Imagine that power condensed into one line of ink. That was the kind of power I held. And yet, doubt crept in. Would revealing my ownership destroy him completely? Would it fracture the family beyond repair? People still debate whether truth always heals, or whether sometimes illusions keep the fragile fabric from tearing. I stared at the documents, weighing truth against silence, legacy against peace. But then I remembered that laugh in the hotel lobby, the humiliation, the dismissive glance, the way others joined his orbit while I stood alone. No, silence was no longer mercy. It was surrender, and I had surrendered long enough. The next gathering would not end in his laugh. It would end in mine. The weeks that followed felt like waiting for thunder after seeing lightning. I carried the envelope in my handbag everywhere, its weight both comforting and heavy. My son's regime grew more theatrical, almost desperate. He started holding what he called family councils in the living room, seating himself at the head like a chairman, dictating who could speak and when. Imagine, our home, which once echoed with laughter and messy arguments, now turned into a parody of a boardroom. He even used a timer to limit our responses, as if our thoughts needed deadlines. My daughter-in-law obeyed quietly, my granddaughter rolled her eyes, and I sat silently, clutching the secret that could flip the entire table upside down. Family dynamics experts often say siblings fracture under the pressure of perceived favoritism, and I began to see that happening. My other children, his sisters, started to push back. One called me late at night whispering, "Why does he act like the house is already his?" Another avoided visits altogether, unwilling to sit through his speeches. People still debate whether strong-willed siblings keep families balanced or just break them apart faster. In my case, the fractures were widening into canyons. The cousins, too, started taking sides. Some flattered him, hoping to stay in his good graces. Others whispered with me, asking if I was all right, their voices tinged with pity. I hated that pity more than his cruelty. Pity feels like a funeral held while you're still alive. I wanted no pity, I wanted respect, and soon they would see why pity was misplaced. One Sunday lunch became particularly tense. My son announced that he would soon make big decisions about the family's future. He said it casually, sipping his wine, as if the matter was already settled. My daughter-in-law glanced nervously at me. My granddaughter stared at her plate, and his sisters exchanged looks across the table. The fracture lines glowed red in that silence. I could almost hear the crackle of loyalty splitting apart. Later that week, he tightened his rules further. He banned certain relatives from visiting without his approval. Too much noise, he claimed. But the truth was, he feared dissent. Dictators, whether in families or nations, always fear dissent. It's a fact I once read. When a regime starts policing visitors, it's already afraid of collapse. People still debate whether that collapse should be nudged or allowed to happen naturally. I chose to be the nudge. My granddaughter sensed it too. She whispered, "Grandma, when will you tell them?" Her eyes burned with the kind of impatience only youth can carry. The reveal needed witnesses, the kind who would retell the story for decades. Families remember such moments like folklore. My daughter-in-law, meanwhile, grew pale with the pressure. She apologized often, saying she was just trying to keep peace. I told her quietly, "Peace without dignity isn't peace." She cried, nodding, her shoulders sagging. It was then I realized she, too, was another victim of his little regime. The study became my war room. I reviewed the documents daily, rehearsing my words. I even practiced in the mirror once, laughing at myself halfway through. Humor, again, softened the weight. "Imagine," I said aloud, "a mother practicing like she's about to give a boardroom presentation to her own son." The absurdity made me chuckle, but behind the laugh was steel. "The fracture among siblings," he exploded, accusing her of undermining family unity. The room split instantly. Some defended him, others sided with her. I sat silently, watching, the envelope heavy in my lap. That was the moment I knew the fracture was wide enough. The reveal would not just silence him, it would bind the broken lines together again, under truth. And so I waited, poised like an archer, my arrow nocked. Every smirk, every lecture, every rule was just more rope he wrapped around himself. When I cut it, the fall would be his alone. The table was set as if nothing unusual would happen that night. Plates gleamed, candles flickered, wine filled the glasses. My son sat tall at the head, his shoulders pulled back. He announced that he would soon take charge of the family's finances, as though it were a matter of destiny, not discussion. My granddaughter's fork clattered against her plate. My daughter-in-law's hands trembled as she poured water. And me? I reached into my bag, fingers brushing the thick envelope, my heart steady. This was the stage I had been waiting for. He spoke of responsibility and vision, claiming he would protect everyone from chaos. Chaos, that was his favorite word. But family isn't chaos. Family is noise, arguments, laughter, love. He didn't know that true order is quiet dignity, not imposed rules. Psychologists often say children confuse control with leadership, repeating the patterns they were raised under. People still debate whether harsh discipline creates resilience or only fear. Watching him, I saw fear disguised as power, an echo of lessons he misunderstood from his childhood. I let him finish his speech. I let him soak in the applause of a few cousins who nodded eagerly, clinging to his imagined crown. Then, with deliberate calm, I placed the envelope on the table. The sound of paper against wood cut through the room sharper than any shout. "Since we are talking about legacy," I said softly, "perhaps you should all see the truth." He froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. His eyes darted to the envelope, then to me. A cousin muttered, "This can't be," but the documents spoke louder than any voice. My son's face drained of color. His lips moved, but no sound came out. The commander had lost his script. I explained, calmly, almost like telling a bedtime story, how I had built the company quietly with my late husband, how I had kept it hidden to protect it, how I had let them all live believing the house was the center of our fortune, when the real heart pulsed downtown in glass towers and boardrooms. "Leadership," I said, my eyes fixed on him, "is not about rules on a fridge. It is about carrying weight without breaking those around you." Laughter bubbled up from somewhere deep in me, not cruel, but liberating. The kind of laugh that says, the play is over. My granddaughter giggled too, unable to hide her delight. For once, laughter didn't humiliate, it healed. The debate sparked instantly. His sisters demanded explanations from him, cousins whispered apologies to me, and his wife cried quietly into her napkin. My son sat stiff, his jaw clenched, his fingers trembling on the table. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked. You deceived us," he whispered. I tilted my head. The fallout was like an aftershock that rattled every corner of the house. My son avoided my gaze for days, skulking around like a dethroned prince whose crown had been snatched mid-speech. His sisters, once cautious, now walked taller, their voices louder at family meals. Cousins who once flattered him now called me, Their tones dipped in newfound respect. My daughter-in-law, relieved, began to breathe again, her nervous smiles replaced with something warmer, freer. And my granddaughter? She glowed with pride, walking by my side as if she were carrying half the crown herself. The regime had ended, but the family was left standing in the rubble, each of us deciding what kind of structure to build next. My son tried once to regain control. He slammed his fist on the table one evening, declaring that I had embarrassed him in front of everyone. His voice shook, not with strength, but with desperation. I let him vent, then replied calmly, "Respect is never stolen. It is surrendered when you confuse control with love." Silence swallowed the room. He left without finishing his meal. Psychologists say when authority collapses, some fight harder before accepting the fall. People still debate whether confrontation heals or whether time is the only medicine. I chose silence again, knowing time would speak louder than I could. Over the next weeks, routines softened. The fridge notes disappeared. The schedules were torn down. The candle at dinner returned, its flame steady, glowing like a quiet triumph. Meals felt less like parades and more like gatherings again. My granddaughter laughed openly now, and her sketches showed flowers instead of crowns. Even my daughter-in-law began telling stories, her voice no longer trapped behind tight smiles. The air felt lighter, though beneath it lingered a hum of unfinished business, because broken bonds don't heal overnight. My son drifted between anger and shame. Sometimes he stayed out late, sometimes he hid in his room. Once I caught him standing outside the study door, his hand hovering over the knob. He didn't enter. Maybe he knew the truth inside had already beaten him. Maybe he feared facing it again. That room remained mine, its papers now less a secret weapon and more a monument to patience. I thought often about inheritance, about legacy. I realized it wasn't just money or documents. It was the lessons passed on, the memories we anchor, the dignity we insist on carrying. Families fracture not because of wealth, but because of silence and pride. People still debate whether passing down wealth strengthens or poisons love. But as I watched my granddaughter slip her small hand into mine, I knew what mattered most wasn't the company papers. It was teaching her that kindness, not cruelty, survives. Humor kept finding me, even in the aftermath. One morning I teased her. "Should we start writing rules for Grandpa's old armchair? Only queens can sit here." She giggled, climbing onto the chair with a playful bow. That laughter filled the house better than any regime ever could. And so the family slowly reshaped. The fractures didn't vanish, but light began to seep through them. My son, stripped of his paper crown, learned, slowly, painfully, that leadership isn't given by demand. Maybe one day he will laugh at his own mistakes. Until then, I carry the truth. His dangerous little regime fell, not because I shouted, but because I waited. The documents remain locked away. Proof of who I am, proof of what patience can build. And every time I see that cruel laugh replay in memory, I remind myself, it was the seed of his downfall and the spark of my quiet triumph. And so, here we are at the end of tonight's journey. The storm that once rattled through the walls of my house has softened into a quiet hum, like rain fading after a long night. My son's little regime, built on fridge notes and rules, could not withstand the weight of truth. It cracked, fell, and left behind the silence in which new voices could finally breathe. The documents in my study still rest in their drawer, not as weapons anymore, but as gentle reminders that patience, when sharpened, is stronger than pride. The candle at the dinner table burns again, and every flicker feels like my late husband smiling from the shadows. Families are complicated. They bend, break, and sometimes repair in ways we can't predict. People will still debate whether silence is wisdom or weakness, whether secrets save or destroy. For me, it was both, a burden I carried and a gift I chose to release. And perhaps that's what legacy really means. Not the papers, not the wealth, but the lesson that dignity, once reclaimed, can never be stolen again. If you've stayed with me this far, you've carried the weight of my story with me. And for that, I want to thank you. You are the reason I share these nights, the reason I turn whispers into words. To all of you who listen, who subscribe, who support this channel, you are the family that chooses to stay, not out of duty, but out of connection. That is the truest kind of inheritance. So now, as the lights dim and the night stretches long, I'll leave you with a soft good night. Protect your dignity, cherish your bonds, and remember, truth always waits, patient and steady, until it's ready to be seen. Good night, my friends.